I'm curious if anything stands out big to you. I have one win total over under play that I really like in the North.
Cincinnati Bengals.
Cleveland what is Browns. The Bengals line? No, it's so for me, it's actually the
Pittsburgh Steelers.
It's the Steelers under. The Bengals are at 10.5, bet a little bit to the over. So mine is the Steelers under because people are betting the over. You can get it at even money on the under. You don't have to pay the vig. And I've heard that the reasoning on Twitter that I've seen is that it's crazy that their win total would be 8.5 because in all 17 of Mike Tomlin's seasons, they've never had a losing record, which would be compelling if not for the fact that, you know, everything hasn't happened until the time that it has. Like, sometimes things change. I think Mike Tomlin is a fantastic coach. I think if you rank the coaches, I think he's in the top 5. If you talk about player development and culture and getting the most out of the guys he has on his roster, he might be number 1. I think he's incredible at that. I think when you start talking about like scheme and some of that stuff, you probably have to dock him a little bit compared to like an Andy Reid. You start talking about some of the in-game decisions, I think you have to dock him a little bit. You'd probably have to dock Andy Reid as well with the way that he likes to use timeouts. But those are, I mean, probably 2 of the best coaches in the NFL, but that's why I wouldn't immediately probably put Tomlin first. But in terms of getting the most out of his team, I think you probably have to put him right there near the top. My issue with scheme is not on the defensive side. It's just like when you let Matt Canada be your offensive coordinator for that long and you're the head guy and you're not making that move, you know, some of the other stuff that they've done the years under Todd Haley and stuff. I mean, he's not always been as into the innovative offensive stuff as you would like. And then they go and hire Arthur Smith this year, which is a big reason why I like the under 8.5, frankly, is that they're going to do things a certain way. And Arthur Smith's teams can win, but they always tried to win. And I just want to continue to emphasize and bash on Arthur Smith that when they won, it was always 1-score games. We talked about this stat a bunch. They had like maybe 3 or 4 wins in his years with Atlanta that were more than 1 score, and they had like 14 multiple score losses. The last I looked at it, I don't know the exact numbers at this moment, but the point is that they were winning on the margins and in these 1-score games, and that was making their team look a little bit better. And Arthur Smith's style of offense and style of play, like it was making it look like it was more effective because they were getting just enough points in enough of these games. I don't know. I don't buy that that's actually indicative of a good offensive system or anything like that. I'm pretty out on the Steelers offense entirely. I don't think Russell Wilson is going to be the answer. I don't even know, as much as we like Justin Fields, Sean, I'm pretty scared. I know you've been in on him as the better of the 2 and the potential for him to actually take over and be good for that offense, but I'm pretty scared about what he's going to mean. And then as far as Tomlin's like history and just thinking through that, I mean, this is a Steelers franchise that certainly he had some say in some of the ways that they built their teams and what they did in developing these players, but they had some really, really great defenses for a long time in his career. They had stability at the quarterback position, which is the most important thing. And now, to be fair, they've had 2 years since Ben Roethlisberger retired, and in the end of Ben Roethlisberger's career, he wasn't great either. But you can also go and say that in the last 6 seasons, they've won fewer than 10 games 4 times, which for a team that's never had a losing record, the only way you can not have a losing record and win fewer than 10 games, it's 8 wins or 9 wins. That's it. They went 8-8 in 2019, and now it has to be 9 wins because you're talking about 17-game season. They went, well, I guess you could have a tie. They went 9-8 in 2022. They went 9-7-1 in 2021. They almost went 8-8-1, which would have proven the counter to my point there. But they have not had a bunch of really strong seasons in their recent history. They went 12-4 in 2020. They went 10-7 last year with a negative point differential. The big discussion last year was the negative point differential, the fact that they were overcoming that. They've actually had a negative point differential in 4 of the last 5 seasons. A lot of people have talked about how that is the Tomlin effect, that they're still 500 or better with these negative point differentials. And I do think that's the Tomlin effect. I also don't think you can live there forever is sort of the point that I would drive home. And then additionally, you look at Tomlin's whole 17 seasons. I'll just go back quite a bit further. He had 2 more 8-8 seasons. He actually had 3 8-8 seasons over the 17 seasons that he's coached, and then 4 seasons where he won 9 games exactly. So 7 out of 17 seasons where they didn't get to double-digit wins. That's still a lot of really good coaching. That's still 10 double-digit win seasons. But this point that he's never had a losing season, just want to emphasize that almost half the seasons have been within like 1 or 2 games of a losing season. It's just one of these stats that is maybe a little bit overplayed, especially when you think about how good those defenses were. The stability at quarterback, again, Roethlisberger. You talk about like a Bill Belichick off a team, and people always say, well, he had Tom Brady for all those years. Bill Belichick's teams went 17 consecutive years, Sean, with double-digit wins every single season, including the year that Tom Brady tore his ACL in the first game. They went 11-5 with Matt Castle. That's a little bit different than just 17 non-losing seasons where 7 of them are under 10 wins. There are either 9 or 8 wins. And people, I'm not making this a Tomlin versus Belichick debate, but people will emphasize that, for Belichick, he had Brady. Well, all I'm saying is for Tomlin, he had stability at quarterback too. Ben Roethlisberger is not Tom Brady, but having stability at quarterback helps you win 8 or 9 games minimum in an NFL season, and having a defense helps. Now, again, once Brady was gone, Belichick's teams weren't good. Once Roethlisberger was gone, Tomlin's been able to win with Kenny Pickett, and he's so bad that they traded him for peanuts. But again, 2 years in a row without Roethlisberger, and even in 2 of the final 3 seasons of Roethlisberger's career, negative point differential where they just were able to eke out enough wins. It's just it's a stat that I don't think those 17 historical seasons say as much as people want it to say for why you would bet an over on an 8.5 this year, because I don't think this Steelers team really has a strong chance to go 11-6 and really blow away this 8-5 or 8.5 number. Maybe they can go 10-7 like they did last year. Probably you're betting that they go 9-8, right? You're betting on the Tomlin magic that he steals some games and they go 9-8 with a negative point differential again, maybe something like that. But I also think it's just as likely that they go 8-9 and they finally end this streak, or they go 7-10, or they crater. I think there are paths to them going 5-12, and this being the year where things look really bad. I go back to that Belichick analogy, 17 straight years of double-digit wins until, he didn't have Brady anymore, but until the team wasn't as good, and then they had a losing record. They didn't have that anymore. Eventually, streaks end. So anyway, the Steelers, to me, especially in this division, and then having to play the NFC East and the AFC West. The AFC West we just talked about has some weak teams in it. The NFC East, Giants, Washington, I guess some weak teams there too, but you have the Cowboys, you have the Eagles, you have the Chiefs on the schedule, you have, potentially a winnable game for Denver when they play the Broncos, potentially a winnable game for the Chargers when they play against Los Angeles. I mean, some decent teams on their schedule. It's not really a hard schedule necessarily, but the interdivision stuff is the bigger concern. 2 games against the Bengals, 2 games against the Browns, 2 games against the Ravens. All of those teams are markedly better on paper and talent-wise. I mean, I know the Steelers still have some good defenders on this roster, but when you talk about, what they're going to be at quarterback and how the offensive scheme that they're going to run out there, that defense better be really, really good.
There'll be less talented players around the quarterbacks this season than a year ago with Deontay Johnson departing. And they're going to start the year with a quarterback who ideally for them has a higher floor and a lower ceiling than the backup, which to me feels a little bit defeatist if you're in a division with the Ravens, the Bengals, and the Browns. I really like their out-of-division matchups, the NFC East, the AFC West. You could win a lot of games there. So that part, I think, is pretty encouraging. But when you're dealing with the Ravens and the Browns, who may be 2 of the best rosters in football, and you're dealing with the Bengals and Joe Burrow and the weapons around him, you're the 4th best team in that division. And I don't think it's particularly close when you think about the fact that they weren't as good as people think. And another way to put all of those great stats that, you just rattled off in terms of what they've actually been over the recent past and even over the last decade is that in 2 of the last 3 seasons, they finished outside the top 20 in yards on both offense and defense, right? I mean, that's not a team that has much margin to deal with. And at some point, I completely and totally agree that regardless of how good the coaching is, if you're trying to win games by 1 or 2 points, which has been the overall approach and has also been the offensive coordinator's approach, if your quarterback is then Russell Wilson, the collapse potential is extremely high. And when you have some of the depth that they have, there are lots of good things about the Steelers. They're definitely not one of the bad teams in the NFL by any stretch, but it's kind of humorous to go in and see that, 2 of their top 4 free agent acquisitions are a punter and Cordero Patterson, right? So you're not going to get a lot of help from the outside. Now, they do sign Patrick Queen to a big contract, but the other things that they're adding are on the offensive side in a way that probably, again, doesn't give you huge 2024 impact. Their first 3 picks are on offense. They need that in order to stabilize the offensive line and then to give you that receiving complement to George Pickens. But one of the elements here is that Pickens is not a number 1. He's a vertical threat that you hope can work off of other guys if you have above average quarterback play. And then Roman Wilson is also sort of a player that you are hoping can fulfill a role. You have Pat Freiermuth, a player that we love, but again, probably just almost definitively more of a role guy and a good role guy, but not a George Kittle, not a Travis Kelce, not a Sam Laporta type of player. When you create a roster that has very little margin to the upside, but a lot of room to the downside, then this would be a situation where I completely agree. I don't think that you want to bet that. How concerned are you with the in-division competition when you look at the other 3 teams here? One of the interesting things when we kind of just look at averages across the 4 AFC divisions, you've got the AFC West and AFC South at about 8.2. You've got the AFC East at about 8.7. I mean, the AFC North is at 9.8. All 4 of these teams are expected to go out and win. Certainly the Ravens and Bengals. On the Browns side, they were a team with a rampaging defense. They had a lot of talent in the running game before the Nick Chubb injury. They scored a lot of points behind Joe Flacco. But that is a team, too, where I think, unlike the Steelers, where you have like the shot that you could go 500 that they're sort of pointing at, with the Browns, you could be anything from a Super Bowl contender to a team that is at the end of the year, trying to figure out like where they go because Deshaun Watson has become their Russell Wilson.
Right. It's probably unfair that I liked the Browns over more because I think you can make a really strong case that the Browns and Steelers situations are very comparable and that the Mike Tomlin type stuff that we were just talking about actually should push you sort of in favor of the Steelers. But I think the Browns have more room to miss, like more upside for us to be wrong. Essentially, if Deshaun Watson gets back to the player that he was in his prime and at his peak, and the reason that he got this massive, fully guaranteed contract, and teams were throwing themselves to give 3 first-round picks to pay him massive amounts of money, even though he had all these sexual abuse allegations. I mean, that's something that happened this guy was thought to be that good, worth that, and obviously has played incredibly poorly since then. But and in fairness, Russell Wilson got a huge trade haul for the Seahawks, signed a huge deal with the Broncos, etc. So their paths are not that incomparable. But Wilson's lack of success over the last couple of years feels more definitive. He's played more football. Watson hasn't even really played a ton. He's missed a lot of time. And, because he missed a whole season with a de facto suspension, there's the whole sort of uncertainty of, was he just rusty and how is he coming back and what's going on there. But I do think that the Browns also just are better defensively and have better talent around him offensively as well. But Nick Chubb coming back from a major injury hurts their rushing attack and some of those things, but they do have just a lot more weapons in the passing game. Amari Cooper and David Njoku both coming off career seasons. They add Jerry Jeudy. They add I guess who was it? Jamari Thrash in the draft. I knew they added a player in the draft, but I guess it was a little bit later. At any rate, they still have Elijah Moore as a potential breakout play. They have a lot of options there. I do actually kind of like the Steelers' backs in fantasy. It's funny as I talk about this, this negativity around the Steelers. Arthur Smith had some pretty boring teams with the Falcons the last couple of years, but has been able to get some value into those running backs. It was Algier before. It wasn't Bijan Robinson to the extent we want, but both Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris are cheap enough, and they're both probably going to get work because he likes to kind of use multiple backs. I think both could be viable parts of zero RB builds and those types of things. It's a lot of guaranteed touches, or the idea of guaranteed touches at a discount, frankly. But other than that, I have a hard time with the passing game with George Pickens' price, all of those things. But to your point, as you were talking through the Tomlin thing, it kind of crystallized for me this idea that we're not saying that Mike Tomlin isn't a great coach and can't get extra stuff out of his team. In fact, we're talking about the fact that he has been able to do that. 4 out of the last 5 years, a negative point differential, and still not having a losing season is incredible. That's really, really incredible. It's still very possible. But when you're talking about betting in these types of situations, you're looking for opportunities where you think the market is maybe missing something. The Steelers line opening at 8.5 is a lot of respect for that trend. And then the fact that people have bet it up and you can get even money, not have to pay minus 110, but get plus 100 on under 8.5 because people want to trust that Tomlin trend. The question is just, are you that confident that the Tomlin effect is, gets you over 8.5 wins in more than 50% of situations? And I just think that's a really intriguing opportunity to say, I think Tomlin's a great coach, but I think this will be his best coaching job yet to be able to continue this streak this year. It's not the same team that he's had for all 17 seasons, where he had a little bit more margin for error, as you put it. But yeah, no, the Browns as well, when you asked about them, there's a lot of uncertainty there and probably not as much margin for error as it has seemed like for them either. I find it interesting that the Bengals were the one team that missed the playoffs last year and went 9-8, and now they have the second highest over-under because the Browns are also at 8.5. The Bengals over-under is up at 10.5, and then the Ravens are up at 11.5, but has been bet heavily to the under. I do expect the Bengals to rebound this year. I think they had a tough year last year, but I think that's what you should sort of expect. And if the AFC North does get a little bit weaker, I think it gets weaker through the Steelers and through the Browns. All 4 teams had winning records last year. The Bengals finished dead last with a 9-8 record, but they also now get to play the last place schedule. So they play, the Titans and the Patriots, and they're already playing the entirety of the AFC West. But to get those teams is great. They also get the Carolina Panthers because their 17th game comes from the NFC South, whereas the Steelers, because they finished third, they get the Falcons, who finished third last year, and so they actually wind up getting the best team in the NFC South. It's a little bit of a bad draw for them. Their third place schedule gives them kind of a tough matchup there. So anyway, I like the Bengals to be in the top 2 with the Ravens quite a bit, like the numbers say, and so I don't really have a strong lean on the bets at the top of the division. Don't know that I really have a strong lean on the Browns at 8.5, but I think the Steelers being the weakest team in the division is the one that I like the most.
Yeah, the thing that jumps out as you talk there is that the Bengals have a sneaky easy schedule. And when you think about how deep they've been able to go in the playoffs, when you think about how they've been able to overcome some really slow starts, when you think about all of the injuries that they've had, they have this not elite but solid defense. that lays the groundwork for their offense to do what it can do. They add Jermaine Burton. You now have dynamic running back play as opposed to all of those touches going to Joe Mixon and having that be essentially completely and totally empty. All you need for the Bengals to crush here is for Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, and Jamar Chase to stay healthy. And I think that that's what everybody is dreaming of, because that's so fun from a fan perspective overall. It's also, what we need in fantasy. Pete and I just drafted a best ball banana stand team with Burrow, Higgins, Burton, and Chase Brown. And we were ecstatic because that team
it's a fun
is so
team.
much fun. The Bengals could go on a huge run here, and I think pull back the title from the Ravens, even though the Ravens were the best team in football for the entirety of last season. And again, for some of the non-divisional things, I think it's not a huge surprise what they're projected to do. And I actually have to say that I love Derrick Henry there. I think that type of, instead of going out and getting a young, peak career, but completely replaceable player, go out and get Derrick Henry. I really like Devontae Walker as someone who may never be relevant for fantasy. But then one of the cool notes here, and again, I'm going to be a lot more sensitive to the fun notes for the guys that I love than all these other players who I don't track as closely. But when the GM is saying, look, we drafted Walker specifically because Lamar Jackson added us to add that kind of threat, that would change the offense for us. It's what you want the team to say. It's a team-centric and biased view. It's a puff PC type of take on things. But I think the Ravens have taken some steps to address what happened to them in the AFC Championship game, and they're going to be really good.
And it's Devontae Walker who's going to be the AFC Championship star in 2024. No, I think that's all. I agree with all that. I'm begrudgingly coming around on the Henry stuff, especially in Underdog. You talk about the half-point PPR and the touchdown upside. Gus Edwards had 13 TDs last year, and I keep talking about how his yards per carry was way down. He didn't look as explosive and all of those things. He was getting older, and yet he still scored 13 touchdowns. Because when you're in a red zone formation with Lamar Jackson, they can't load the box. He'll just pull it, go around the end. Which, that's what Derrick Henry's been a lead at for most of his career. You get him going downhill with the threat of Lamar Jackson pulling. They probably will never pass in the red zone. Why would they? They could just run an old school read option offense. That's just a really dynamic short area offense. They're going to score a lot of rushing touchdowns, I think, and Derrick Henry is going to certainly benefit from that. So I think those are great points. The other thing is, as you were talking through the Bengals, I had just said some positive stuff about Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris in best ball. And yet you mentioned Chase Brown. Chase Brown and Zach Moss, I think they're both cheaper, or they were, last I was looking at it. We're talking about the Bengals as being an offense we trust a lot more and probably going to score a whole lot more points. To get both of the key players in that backfield even cheaper, worth noting, that's certainly exciting as well. So there's a lot of ways to play the committee backfields in not all committees. We were just talking about the Ravens, but the backfields in the AFC North are all pretty intriguing, I think. The AFC East, Sean, we kind of are just redoing last year, where it's the Jets have Aaron Rodgers. What's that going to mean? We didn't really find out last year. They have a 9.5 win total. It's been bet to the over a little bit. People think they're going to be a 10-win team more likely than a 9-win team. Just very slightly bet to the over, I should say. You have the Dolphins at 9.5 wins being bet a little bit heavier to the over. You have the Bills at 10.5 wins being bet a little bit to the under. They're trying to build the Kansas City Chiefs plan where you don't have any star receivers, but you just have 19 interesting names. They went ahead and added Marquez Valdes-Scantling to make that as much like the Chiefs as they possibly could. Sean, I think right now Curtis Samuel is a pretty exciting player in this offense. He's probably the best guy they have, but Keon Coleman also absolute quote machine. This guy seems like he's going to be a star just because every time I hear him talk, I'm like, this guy rules. I want to root for him. Does have some question marks in his profile, but early second round pick. But they also added Mac Hollins. They added Quintus Cephas. They added Chase Claypool. They added KJ Hamler. They still have Andy Isabella, who they had for a little while last year. They have Justin Shorter, who was a 5th round pick for them last year. They still have Khalil Shakir, I haven't even mentioned yet. There's a lot of dudes you can talk yourself into being like relevant for this passing game. Like I was trying to talk myself into KJ Hamler the other day until I realized that there's 10 guys that are like KJ Hamler.
Then you just mentioned a bunch of people who are out of the NFL in 2021. When you come and say, and this is certainly the case, you look at the ADPs and they're kind of crazy. When you say Curtis Samuel is exciting in this offense, you're like, I am betting like every dollar that I have under on the Buffalo Bills. Right?
Yeah,
this is a team that went for it across the board with their trades, their defensive signings. They made some mistakes. They lost the key playoff game to the Kansas City Chiefs. They lost the embarrassing game at home to the Cincinnati Bengals. They lose a bunch of games last year that they shouldn't have lost. And they have this crisis of identity despite the massive point differential. They go run heavy. They're saying, we're going to beat you with James Cook and Ray Davis. We're going to beat you with James Cook, Ray Davis, and Curtis Samuel.
Dalton Kincaid.
Dalton Kincaid. Yeah, Dalton Kincaid, yes. You can draft him in every single draft. I'm hoping that at some point in this discussion, I can get you to say that the New York Jets are the clear favorite in this division. In part,
I don't think you're going to, but that's
because the Bills, Dolphins, and Jets are all potential collapse teams. And one of those potential collapse teams is going to not collapse and they're going to win, because certainly it's not going to be the New England Patriots, who don't seem inclined to get off to a fast start with the number 3 overall pick in the draft. The Bills have hemorrhaged a lot of talent, and they now have a more questionable stylistic approach to NFL games, which is going to give them that smaller margin. Maybe it limits the mistakes that Josh Allen makes, but I don't think you can get to a point in your window with Josh Allen and be like, we're going to try and win a different way. It's like, you've got one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. That has to be the way that you try and win it. The corresponding element here, though, is that the Dolphins have also gone all in, and it has created problems for them from a depth perspective. Now, the Miami Dolphins, through the first 2/3 of last season, might have been the best team in the NFL. And then you start to have all of those injuries on defense, because the defense was elite last season before all of that happened. You had a great balance between this Tua, Tyreek Hill, Devon Achane juggernaut, and a rampaging defense that was underrated and that was giving teams a ton of trouble. But you have those injuries, and then in the offseason, you have this salary cap related exodus where they lose 3 really good players, a 4th and a 5th, who were also contributors. Now, they do bring guys in. They try and be very savvy with their signings. They paper over some of that loss. They add names like a Jonnu Smith to try and give them more yards after the catch at the tight end position. Obviously, we know they've added Odell Beckham. They make what I think was a really savvy pick late in the draft in Malik Washington. You dive into his profile, and he's basically Malachi Corley, except way better, right? And the difference in what they spent versus what the Jets spent. And it's relevant because both of these teams are potentially at the end of a window. We know that the Jets have gone all in with Aaron Rodgers and all of his entourage, and them being so completely embedded in the team. And then when that didn't work out last year because of the injury, they were awful. But when you look at this, for this season, the Dolphins and the Bills do seem like teams in mild decline. Now, when you talk about a team in decline, when you're coming off of having been, possibly, if you look at the top, say, 5 teams in the NFL last year, you're looking at the Chiefs, the Ravens, the 49ers, and then the Bills and the Dolphins. So they're coming from a very high point when they're falling, but we don't know how much the fall will be. We don't know how swift it'll occur. these three teams, I should say, when you include the Jets in there with Aaron Rodgers, they're pretty close together in terms of expectations. If Rodgers can stay healthy, that team then I think becomes the most exciting, because we watched what the defense was able to do as they had to try and cover up for Zach Wilson. And now this is a team where if you get, I mean, you're not going to get the MVP level play, but Aaron Rodgers is a guy who's in that, 9th, 10th range, maybe in terms of GOAT discussions. And he gets Garrett Wilson. He gets Breece Hall, one of the 2 or 3 running backs in the entire NFL who is a difference maker, who can allow you to do something in the running game. I don't really want this to be my take because, I mean, this isn't unique, but I'm pretty anti Aaron Rodgers, but I do think that this Jets team is primed to take this division.
In trying to defend the take, I will say that I didn't understand from Jets fans this offseason really, or late in the season, really wanting to clean house, really wanting to get rid of Robert Saleh. I think Robert Saleh was brought in as a defensive head coach for the defense. And then you go and you sell your soul to bring in Aaron Rodgers, and you bring in Nathaniel Hackett to tie all that together, and you say, that's the offense, right? Like, no one wants Nathaniel Hackett to be your offensive coordinator, but you're doing it because he's Aaron Rodgers' buddy. And like the latest report was there's concern about Nathaniel Hackett as the offensive coordinator. And yet during the summer last year and, in training camp and some of that stuff, when he would call plays, Rodgers would just change the play at the line of scrimmage. And they're kind of just hoping that he can do that all season and be the offensive coordinator on the field, which I mean, in some respects, he loves to make the changes at the line. He's a veteran, a really long-term veteran. He's seen a lot of stuff. Letting him make some of those decisions at the line, I think you saw a lot of that with Peyton Manning in his Denver Broncos tenure at the end of his career, where he was making a lot of changes at the line, a lot of that stuff. I would say that I trust Peyton Manning's mind a little bit more, and I thought that he was so sharp at that point that he could have been an offensive coordinator in the NFL right away after he retired if he wanted to, and I still think to this day could easily be that. You hear him talk about the game, you watch the Manning cast, all that stuff. He's incredibly sharp. Rodgers is too, but also maybe just a little bit, crazy. So we don't know for sure if he's able to keep sort of his ego in check and some of that stuff, which is important. And having said that, Saleh was brought in for the defense, was the point I was trying to make. They were 3rd in yards against last year. They're 12th in points because their offense sucked. I mean, you give up terrible field position and those things, that's not going to help. They were 4th in yards allowed the year before. Robert Saleh's Jets defenses in seasons where Zach Wilson was his primary quarterback, and couldn't sustain drives, and they were constantly turning the ball over and giving opposition teams more possessions than they frankly had a right to have. Still, just in yards allowed, was top 4 in yards allowed each of the last 2 years. That's a really impressive feat. A lot of the times, you talk about like the Chiefs being 2nd in yards allowed. We talked about that a little bit earlier. A lot of the time that kind of thing can happen is because you have Patrick Mahomes on the other side, and late in the games he's able to hold on to the ball when they're winning, and he's able to sustain drives and put games away and kneel games out, so the defense doesn't have to come out and play garbage time and give up garbage time yards or other things where the offense is in these situations. This Jets defense, with a horrible offense both years, was still that good defensively. I mean, it's a legitimately dominant offense or defense. So in terms of trying to understand your take that the Jets should be favored, I think it's reasonable to say that the defense is that good. And so as long as Aaron Rodgers stays healthy and gives them competent offensive play, which with Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson, and if Rodgers is healthy, you should expect competent offensive play. I think Mike Williams is a nice fit for these guys. I mean, I think they're actually in a position where they could be a relatively decent offense if Rodgers stays healthy, if Nathaniel Hackett's not too big of an issue. So, I mean, I can kind of get behind this take a little bit, Sean, other than the part where you said the Bills are big, or you said the Bills, Dolphins, and Jets are all sort of collapse risks. I don't think I buy that for the Bills. I don't love what they did with their receiving weapons. The difference, I think, between what the Chiefs did and what the Bills did, I think Patrick Mahomes is the better quarterback, but Josh Allen stylistically can do a lot of things that doesn't actually even require pass catchers, right? He can scramble and run guys over. Now he has to stay healthy and do all that. And Mahomes is a great scrambler too. I'm not trying to, necessarily even, compare that part of their games, but I do think we're going to see the Josh Allen rushing. And then I do think he has added enough as a passer. I think to think that they're a big collapse risk, you almost have to believe that narrative that Stephon Diggs has sort of implied on social media, that the reason that Josh Allen's passing numbers started getting better is Stephon Diggs showed up in town, that everything got a little better when Diggs got there, and that it didn't also relate to Josh Allen just developing as a passer and getting a lot better, because I believe that side of it, that Allen has developed, is a better quarterback now, and will be able to carry receivers to a little bit of a degree, while also probably having to run a little. Now, I mean, if they're playing a lot of Marcus Valdes-Scantling, that's a problem, right? Like, I want to see Curtis Samuel, Keon Coleman, and Dalton Kincaid out there as like their three main guys in most situations. And then you hope that, whoever else you're playing is adding something, whether that's KJ Hamler or Chase Claypool or Quintez Cephas, who are the like three dudes that I think are worth trying, but probably won't even make the team. It'll probably be like Mac Hollins, or Khalil Shakir, who I know a lot of people really like. I don't think his numbers really warrant that necessarily when you dig into some of the per out stuff, but he could get into a bigger role and maybe start to earn a little bit more volume in those things. But I think you lean into the uncertainty of Kincaid and Coleman, the young players, and Curtis Samuel being a decent veteran, is like, if you're playing those guys, that's at least a serviceable top three. It's not great, but Josh Allen's skill set, in addition to that, I think saves you from having like a massive collapse risk offensively. Now, I mean, their defense is a concern, and there's reasons to worry about that side of the ball too. You talked about Miami not having as much depth and the way that they've built, and that's a concern. The only note I had for this division was the Patriots have an over under of 4.5. It's been bet really heavily to the over. I think it's like the biggest, the juice on it is bigger than any other bet on the board. They're minus 160 to the over. I don't think you want to go out and pay that price necessarily, but I do think they're likely to probably go over 4.5 wins. We'll see, but they have a pretty good defense themselves, and Drake May could make the offense better. Not a lot of reason to think they'll be like horrendous. 4.5 gives you a lot of room to err on the side of missing above, but who knows, But anyway, the Jets, Bills, and Dolphins thing, the way you laid it out, I think was really interesting, and throwing some of those thoughts about the Bills out there certainly has me considering this division a little bit differently. Maybe it's one that feels a little bit more uncertain than I thought. And yeah, I mean, I do think the Dolphins and the Jets are big collapse risks, but could also be really good. And so you have this, who knows what happens at the top of the division. Maybe the Bills are worse than I'm suggesting. I don't think they're going to lose. I mean, maybe they fall to like 9-8 like the Bengals did. Maybe that's the collapse that you're talking about. But I don't know that they fall to a losing record with Josh Allen. And so
it will be collapse in context, but
yeah,
the context being that maybe the ceiling isn't as high as people are considering. And there are some, when I think about the AFC East, and I'm thinking about from a coaching perspective too, if we had to deal with hurdles, if you have to really get over some difficult things that happen in the season, have we seen that from Sean McDermott in a way that would lead you to believe that he's doing something separate from what the talent is on their roster? I'm a pretty huge believer in Mike McDaniel there with the Dolphins. I think he can cover some things up. You mentioned Robert Saleh is the defensive guy there with the Jets. from a full coaching perspective, obviously you have huge questions about the Jets, but from a head coaching and a defensive perspective, I think that at least those two teams have individual guys who bring something very meaningful to the table in the portion of the team that they coach. I'm not sure that is true for the Bills. And it's not something where I think they're poorly coached. I don't want it to come out that way either. But in terms of a difference maker on the coaching side, I feel more comfortable with the Dolphins and the Jets. And then there's this element, if we're going to do a little bit of nitpicking, I've talked about some of the structural things for these AFC East teams that are maybe a little bit troubling. I would argue that they also had drafts that are underwhelming in that the Bills move back and allow some other teams to take receivers who maybe would have been good options for them. They select a guy in Coleman. And the first thing that jumped to mind when you're talking about him being a social media star is Juju Smith-Schuster and how dynamic, exciting, fun he was. And certainly that was really cool when he gets off to that fast start and is awesome for a couple of years. It becomes less relevant, obviously, when your knees go and you can no longer play. The thing with Coleman that is, I think, controversial and maybe will have no effect because, again, Josh Allen is so unique that even with the limitations, I guess I do come down on Diggs' side there a little bit when you look at some of the things that they've had to do to make the offense work. You look at some of the situations in games where the Bills fail late. You look at some of these close games they're losing. You look at what's happened to them consistently in the playoffs. And that's not to say that someone is, any type of a choke or has those types of problems, but just you want to be aware of what the full resume is or the full kind of portfolio of traits, because Josh Allen has so many fantastic traits that we don't want to ignore the things that he doesn't do well that have been a problem for the team. You look at Keon Coleman, and they drafted a guy number 33 overall who was a full yard per route below the monster that the Eagles drafted at the very end of the draft, right? If you had to take those two players and say which one is even better straight up, it maybe isn't as clear. It certainly isn't as clear as what those draft picks would indicate. You look at the New York Jets, and they do not have a second round pick, and yet felt like Malachi Corley, a guy with a 5th or 6th round profile, was the way to spend pick 65. You look at the Miami Dolphins, who don't have a 3rd round pick because of some of the things that they supposedly did. And that selection ends up being forfeited, and they take a running back in round 4. I love the running back. I also think Malik Washington, as I said, is a savvy pick. But from a roster construction perspective, when you are limited, did they go the right route there? So, again, those are nitpicks. But I think when you look at what the AFC East has done to try and position themselves for winning in 2024, we maybe have some short-term decisions that are going to come back to haunt these guys. And one of the things that we know from Dynasty Fantasy Football and just all areas of life is that when you make short-term decisions that have some long-term consequences, sometimes the long-term consequences hit you faster than you were expecting because the choice just overall was bad.
And Sean, as you're saying that, I pulled up the division odds, the odds to win the division. You can go bet on each individual team to win their division. The Bills at plus 160 are the longest odds of a favorite for any division. The Jets and Dolphins are tied at plus 200, not far behind. And so that also means that that gives you the shortest odds for the 3rd best odds in a division. There's no division that has 3 teams at plus 200 or higher or shorter odds. And they're also close and bunched together. I think the market is agreeing with your assessment here that it's a lot more of a toss-up than I came into this podcast thinking. I didn't think I had a lot of interesting takeaways for the AFC East. You've given me and the listeners something interesting to chew on, where the way the market suggests it, the Bills are the most fragile favorite of not just the AFC, but the entire NFL. And that both the Jets and the Dolphins are right there with them and could win this division. It'll be interesting. The Texans are plus 110 in the South. The Ravens plus 115 in the North. The Bengals not far behind at plus 165. The Browns and Steelers at least 6-1. So the market is actually saying the North's kind of going to be a little bit of a gap there. The Chiefs minus 225. The biggest favorite, the strongest favorite of all the teams. In fact, the only other ones that are in the minus money that are better than 1-1 odds are the 49ers in the NFC West, the Atlanta Falcons, and the NFC South. Shawn, we're going to talk about the NFC. The next time we jump on, we'll go through the NFC divisions, any big takeaways we have. The AFC seemed more fun. That's why we started there. There was a lot of fun stuff to discuss. We'll have to dig a little bit into the NFC and what it means. There's some things that we can definitely talk about. But yeah, some fun stuff to think about for the 2024 fantasy season as we think about it on the team level in the AFC today.
Ben, Kansas City Chiefs over Houston Texans in the AFC Championship game. Who do you have?
I think that's a really fun bet on who's going to play. Where's the game being played? Who got home field? I think the Texans could potentially have home field in that game. If it's in Houston, I'm taking CJ Stroud and the Texans.
So we have Texans over Chiefs as well. That'll do it for the full audio version of this AFC centric episode of Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. Make sure you get over there, sign up for Stealing Signals, sign up for Stealing Lines. Ben has some video projects he's going to pull together this summer that you don't want to miss. Follow him on Yards Per Gretch so you know when those are coming out. You can get in on the ground floor there. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz. The coupon code RVRadio2024 at checkout. That'll give you a 10% discount on your 1-year subscription. Ben would love to have you over at Ship Chasing. I would love to have you at OT and the Best Ball Banana Stand. Check us out in those spaces as well. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.